My impudent parents want me to give my house to my golden brother. I was sitting in my living room scrolling through my phone when my parents called me out of the blue. They said they wanted to come over to talk about something important. I didn't think much of it at first. They'd always been the type to make a big deal out of small things, like when they insisted I help my younger brother Dan with his car payments, because he was still finding his way. Dan's 28, by the way, and has a knack for getting whatever he wants without much effort. I'd worked hard to buy my house. A small but cozy three-bedroom place I'd saved up for over years of grinding at my job. It was my pride and joy, a place I could finally call my own after years of renting. So when my parents showed up that Saturday morning, I had no idea they were about to turn my world inside out. They sat on my couch, looking a bit too serious for my liking. Mom started by asking how I was doing, but it felt like a formality. Dad cut to the chase pretty fast. They said Dan was struggling. He'd been living in a cramped apartment, couldn't afford anything better, and was stressed out because of it. They went on about how he'd always looked up to me, how he deserved a chance to get ahead. I nodded along, waiting for the part where they'd asked me to loan him some cash or maybe co-sign a lease. That's usually how these talks went, but then they said something that made my jaw clench. They wanted me to give Dan my house. Not sell it to him, not rent it out. Straight up hand it over. Their reasoning? Dan needed stability, and since I was doing so well, I could just start over and buy another place. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what I'd just heard. My house, the one I'd spent years saving for, was supposed to be handed to Dan because he was having a rough time? They made it sound like it was my duty as the older sibling to fix his life. They even had a plan. I'd move into a smaller apartment, Dan would take over my mortgage payments, which they swore he could handle, and everyone would be happy. Except me, apparently. They kept emphasizing how Dan was special and needed a break, how he'd always been the one they worried about. I couldn't believe they were serious, but the way they looked at me, like I was selfish for even hesitating, made it clear they meant every word. I asked why Dan couldn't just move in with them if he needed help. They brushed it off, saying their place was too small and Dan needed his own space. Then they started talking about how I'd always been the responsible one, the one who had it together so I could handle starting over. It felt like they were punishing me for being independent while rewarding Dan for coasting through life. I told them I'd think about it, mostly to get them to leave before I said something I'd regret. After they left, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the walls I'd painted myself, wondering how my parents could even suggest something so unfair. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with them about Dan. Growing up, he'd always been the favorite. He got away with everything, skipping chores, flunking classes, even totaling Dad's car once. Meanwhile, I was expected to be perfect. Good grades, part-time job, no complaints. I never minded too much because I figured that's just how families worked. But this was a whole new level. They weren't just favoring Dan. They were asking me to sacrifice something I'd worked my ass off for. I started wondering if they'd always seen me as the one who'd just figure it out while Dan got a free pass. I decided to call Dan to see if he even knew about this plan. When I brought it up, he acted like it was no big deal. He said he'd mentioned to Mom that he liked my house and she must have run with it. He didn't sound like he was pushing for it, but he also didn't say he'd turn it down. That bothered me. I hung up feeling like he was waiting for me to cave, like he always did when he wanted something. I started thinking about all the times I'd bailed him out, covering his rent, lending him my car, even paying for his phone bill when he was between jobs. Had I been enabling this golden child nonsense all along? By the end of the week, my parents were calling again, asking if I hadn't made a decision. They sounded impatient, like I was holding up some urgent family project. I told them I wasn't ready to talk, but they kept pushing, saying Dan was counting on me. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a one-time conversation. They were going to keep at it until they got what they wanted. I started wondering what would happen if I stood my ground. Would they guilt-trip me forever? Would they turn the rest of the family against me? I didn't know, but I was starting to feel like this was a fight I couldn't avoid. After that first conversation with my parents, things got tense fast. They started calling me almost every day, leaving voicemails about how Dan was really struggling and how I needed to step up as the older sibling. I ignored most of their calls, but the messages piled up, each one making me feel like I was the bad guy for not immediately signing over my deed. I wasn't ready to give in, but the pressure was getting to me. I'd walk around my house, looking at the furniture I'd picked out, the backyard I'd spent weekends fixing up, and it hit me hard that they expected me to just walk away from it all. My house wasn't just a thing, it was proof I'd made it on my own. And now they wanted me to hand it to Dan, who'd never shown he could handle that kind of responsibility. I decided to dig into why they thought Dan needed my house so badly. I called my aunt, who's always been the most level-headed person in our family. She told me Dan had been complaining to my parents about his apartment for months, saying it was too small for his lifestyle. Apparently, he'd been dropping hints about wanting a bigger place, and my parents ate it up. They'd always seen Dan as the kid who needed coddling, while I was the one who could handle anything. My aunt didn't know about their plan to give him my house, though, and when I told her, she was floored. She said it sounded like they were trying to fix Dan's problems by dumping them on me. That conversation stuck with me. It made me realize my parents weren't just asking for a favor, they were trying to rearrange my life to prop up Dan's. I started looking into Dan's situation myself. I knew he wasn't great with money, but I wanted to know how bad it really was. A friend of mine works at the same company as Dan, so I asked her to fill me in. She said Dan was always talking about buying fancy gadgets and going out with friends, even though he complained about being broke. He'd gotten a decent job a year ago, but he was still living paycheck to paycheck because he spent everything he made. It didn't sound like someone who was ready to take on a mortgage, no matter what my parents said. I started wondering if they even cared whether Dan could handle the payments, or if they just wanted me to bail him out again. The next time my parents came over, I was ready to push back. I asked them straight up why they thought Dan deserved my house more than I did. They got defensive, saying they weren't trying to take anything from me, just helping the family. They kept going on about how Dan needed a fresh start, how he'd been through so much, they never specified what, and how I was in a better position to start over. I pointed out that I'd worked for years to buy this place while Dan had never saved a dime. They didn't have an answer for that. Instead, they changed the subject, talking about how Dan looked up to me and how this could be a chance to set an example. I wasn't buying it. I told them I wasn't giving up my house, but they just looked disappointed, like I'd failed some kind of loyalty test. After they left, I felt a mix of anger and guilt. I hated how they made me feel like I was being selfish for wanting to keep what I'd earned. But I also started second-guessing myself. What if Dan really was struggling in a way I didn't understand? What if I was being too hard on him? I decided to meet up with Dan to get his side of things. We grabbed coffee at a local place and I laid it all out, how Mom and Dad were pushing me to give him my house. He acted surprised, but not as shocked as I expected. He said he'd never asked for it directly, but he admitted he'd told our parents he was jealous of my place. He said it made sense for him to have it since I could always get another one. That's when I realized Dan wasn't just a bystander in this. He was happy to let our parents fight his battles for him. I went home that night and started thinking about what to do next. I knew my parents weren't going to drop this. They'd already started looping in other family members because my cousin texted me asking why I was being so hard on Dan. It felt like they were building a campaign against me. I started looking into my options. Could I legally protect my house? Did I need to set clearer boundaries? I even thought about moving farther away to avoid the constant pressure. One thing was clear, this wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about whether I was going to keep letting my family treat me like the one who always had to sacrifice. Things came to a head a few weeks after my coffee meetup with Dan. My parents weren't letting up. They'd moved from phone calls to showing up at my house unannounced. Each visit a repeat of the same lecture about how I needed to help Dan. They'd even started roping in other relatives, and I was getting texts from aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years, all saying I should do the right thing for my brother. It was clear they'd been fed a version of the story where I was the successful sibling hoarding my house, while Dan was practically homeless. The pressure was relentless, and I was starting to feel like I was fighting a losing battle just to keep what was mine. I decided I needed to confront the situation head on. I invited my parents over for a serious talk, but this time I set the terms. I told them I wasn't going to discuss giving Dan my house unless they could explain why it was fair. When they arrived, they looked ready for a fight, but I stayed calm. I laid out everything. How I'd worked for years to buy the house, how Dan had never shown he could manage that kind of responsibility, and how it felt like they were punishing me for being independent. They tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I said I loved Dan, but I wasn't going to upend my life to fix his. For the first time, they didn't have a quick comeback. Mom just looked uncomfortable, and Dad kept saying it was about family unity. I asked them point blank why they thought Dan deserved my house more than I did. They admitted Dan had been talking about moving in with them, but they didn't want him there because it would disrupt their routine. That was a gut punch. They were willing to disrupt my entire life, but not their own? I told them if Dan needed a place so badly, they could figure out a way to help him without involving me. They left without saying much, but I could tell they weren't happy. For the first time, I felt like I'd gotten through to them, even if just a little. After that, I reached out to Dan again. I wanted to clear the air and make sure he understood my position. We met at a park, and I told him I wasn't giving up my house, but I'd help him look for a better apartment or figure out a budget if he needed it. He got quiet, then admitted he'd been leaning on our parents too much. He said he didn't expect me to give him the house, but thought it'd be cool to live there. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest I'd ever gotten to one from him. I suggested he talk to our parents about standing on his own, but I could tell he wasn't ready to hear it. Still, I felt like I'd at least drawn a line. The fallout wasn't pretty. My parents stopped coming over, and their calls dropped off. I heard from my cousin that they were telling everyone I'd turned my back on family. It stung. But I was done feeling guilty for protecting what I'd earned. I started setting stricter boundaries, like not answering their calls unless they agreed to talk about something other than Dan. It took months, but they eventually backed off. Dan ended up moving into a smaller apartment he could afford, though I'm pretty sure our parents were helping with the rent. He never brought up the house again, and our relationship stayed civil but distant. Looking back, I realized this whole mess wasn't just about a house, it was about how my family saw me. I'd always been the one they relied on, the one who'd figure it out, while Dan got a free pass. Standing my ground was hard, but it taught me I had to put myself first sometimes. My house is still mine, and every time I walk through the door, I'm reminded that I fought for it. Things with my parents are still strained, but I'm okay with that. I've started building a life where I don't have to justify keeping what's mine, and that feels like a win.